Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this instalment of our student lecture series. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Stuart Pimm to the University of Derby for what promises to be a fascinating and inspiring talk. Everybody associates Stuart Pimm with the USA, but little known fact, he was born in Derbyshire, and that makes him one of our own. Stuart received his undergraduate degree from Oxford University in 1971 before gaining a PhD in New Mexico State University in 1974. Stuart now holds the office of Professor of Conservation at Duke University, and he's an internationally recognised global leader in the study of biodiversity, especially present-day extinctions and what the world can do to prevent them. His message that we can all make a difference to our planet's survival inspires a global audience. Stuart's commitment to the science policy interface has led to his regular testimony to both House and Senate committees of the US Congress. He frequently visits Washington, D.C. to engage policymakers on environmental issues. He's also asked to advise international governments on biodiversity issues and the management of national parks. In addition to his conservation efforts in Africa, Stuart's worked in the forests of Colombia, Ecuador and Brazil. A new species of wasp from the cloud forests of Colombia's tropical Andes has been named Dolichomyces pimmi in honor of his conservation efforts in that region. In the last decade, he's been active in training Chinese conservation professionals and spends a month in China each year. Professor Pimm directs Saving Nature, a non-profit organisation that uses carbon offset donations to fund conservation groups in areas of exceptional tropical diversity in order to restore their degraded habitats. He's the author of over 350 papers and 5 books, including his highly acclaimed and fantastically named The World According to Pimm, A Scientist Audits the Earth, which is an important assessment of the human impact on the planet. In 2019, Stuart was awarded the 2019 International Cosmos Prize, one of the most prestigious honours in the environmental field. It recognises his groundbreaking research on endangered species and his work at Saving Nature to promote practical approaches to reverse species declines by protecting and restoring their shrinking and fragmenting habitats. His international honours include the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement in 2010, and the A.H. Heineken Prize for Environmental Sciences from the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2006. So Stuart's going to talk in a second or two. What I would ask you is, if you have any questions, then please don't hesitate to pop those in the chat, because hopefully we'll have some time for a quick question answer at the end. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I give you Professor Stuart Pimm. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am just delighted to be talking to the University of Derby. As is entirely obvious, it's Derbyshire, from whence I come, and so this is a particularly pleasant homecoming. What I'm going to be talking about today has everything to do with what the nations of the world are going to be doing in Kunming in China later on in this year. That is to decide an agenda for protecting the planet and protecting its biodiversity, hopefully for the next decade or so. And one of the ideas that's floating around is what I'm calling the 30% solution. The idea that we should be protecting 30% of the land and 30% of the oceans by 2030. Has a sort of a nice, ring to it. So I want to talk about the science about that, but I also want to talk about how I got involved in this. I've been asked to talk about those sort of original ideas and where I got them from. So in the COP15, the Conference of the Parties 15th meeting, which was to be last year, but obviously has been delayed. I want to talk about what I think the aspirations will be, the 30, 30, 30, 30, 30. I want to talk about what the previous aspirations were, and did we achieve them? And I also want to talk about how we can do better. So I've been asked to talk about how I got from a boy at Bemrose Grammar School. There I am, looking very cheerful in my Bemrose uniform in 1962. To first of all, how I got to meet the very charming King Willem Alexander, the King of the Netherlands, and received the laureate from the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2006. And also 2 years ago, how I got to meet the Emperor of Japan when I won the International Cosmos Prize. I am not a royal groupie. I have not met any of the British royalty ever. One is never a hero in one's own land, I understand. But what did this journey of mine involve? And how did what I learned in Derbyshire help me on this path? Well, the interesting thing is that it was formative in two important ways. I remember leaving Derby very dark and early one winter's morning in the mid-1960s on a bus organized by Barry Potter of the Derbyshire Ornithological Society. We drove to Hilbre Island in Merseyside. We had to get there at the right time. At the right time, at low tide, you can walk across to Hilbre, and then the tide comes in and isolates you. You really are on an island. And the reason to that was to go bird watching. All the waders get piled up on the shore, and this was a great place to see waders that are hard to see anywhere else. But that interest in these small islands was, a passion of mine. They are places where rare birds turn up. But interestingly, they are places where generations of birders have counted the number of breeding pairs on each of these islands. There's a long record of people counting how many robins and how many blackbirds and whatever nest on the island. And that extraordinary database from Hilbre, from Skomer, from Scolthead Island, from Fair Isle, from the Scillies, Bardsey, that database, which I assembled many, many years ago, allows us to look at how very small populations survive. Many of them wink out quite quickly, and it gives us an important insight into the vulnerability of tiny populations. Now, the populations of blackbirds that nest on the Bardsey, for example, when they go extinct, it's not that the species goes extinct. They survive elsewhere on the mainland. But the risk that they suffer from being a tiny population gave my colleagues, Jared Diamond and I, this important insight into understanding the risks that small populations suffer. The second theme is, how do I sort of put this? Up in the top left was a holiday in about 1958, camping in the Lake District in what we Brits laughingly call our summer. It rains all the time. And I think perhaps that did two things for me. The first one is that if you can do field work in Britain, you can do field work anywhere. Britain in the wintertime, out in the open, is a really cold, wet, challenging place. If you can handle Britain, you can handle anything. But it also gave me an enormous sense of adventure. And so that by 1970, there I am in the deserts of Afghanistan on an Oxford University expedition I led. So that a sense of adventure, but also the sense of exploring what we would now call biodiversity, the fact there are different species in different places. Those sort of passions and interests were very much what stimulated me to go on a student expedition to Afghanistan. The first one I went on was organized by friends in Derby who we met up at the Seven Stars pub and hatched an expedition plan. And then I led my own trip in 1970. And so that exploration of biodiversity has been a common theme of what I've done in my career. So let's go back to the 30-30 idea. Top right, we've got Boris, who is promising 30% of the UK protected by 2030. That amounts to 400,000 hectares. The American president, Joe Biden, is saying he's going to protect 30%. And in the position paper that President Xi Jinping has created, certainly with a lot of help from close Chinese colleagues, he too is talking about expanding their protection from the current 18% to 30%. So there's this global interest in protecting more of the planet. Now, is it necessary? Is it sufficient? The first thing to understand is that, well, no, it's not sufficient. For the Amazon, we know that 30% will not be enough. Work by my close friends, Thomas Lovejoy, Carlos Nobre, have pointed out that if we don't protect a lot more than 30% of the Amazon, in fact, if we don't protect probably 70% of the Amazon, it's going to tip from a tropical forest to a dry savanna. It's going to create a massive environmental shift. Now, I am a critic of global tipping points. I think they are hyperbole. I think they're grandstanding. But regional tipping points like this one in the Amazon are all too clear. There are some ecosystems that we have to retain very substantial amounts of them unless we're going to see massive shifts. So 30% is not going to be enough. The global efforts to boycott Brazil if it doesn't do something to protect the Amazon and its peoples are well taken. Let's look much closer to home. The picture on the left is the Packhorse Bridge north of the dams on the Manchester to Sheffield Road. It's a site of considerable personal significance to me. My parents met on that bridge for the first time, and when they died, I scattered their ashes there. We are fortunate in Derbyshire to have some wonderful wild areas. But I also think we need to understand that in much of our open land, what we have is nothing like the original vegetation. Much of the forest in this area of North Derbyshire is alien trees that have been brought in from other countries for forestry purposes. And much of the upland moorland needs to be restored. And there are hugely important efforts to restore Britain's forests and Britain's uplands. And so, 400,000 hectares, is a catchy number, but it doesn't capture the fact that we need to restore what we've got in Derbyshire and elsewhere to the native vegetation. I'm not going to go through China and the US and other areas and the challenges that they have because I don't have time, but clearly different nations have different challenges. India, for example, has only protected about 5% of its land. It's going to have difficulty in protecting 7%, let alone 30%. What I want to talk about next is to what did countries aspire previously? What were the previous goals, and did we achieve them? So a decade ago, the UN declared the Decade of Biodiversity, 2011 to 2020. And there were two biodiversity targets. The one was to protect 17% of terrestrial and inland water ecosystems. And the second was to prevent the extinctions of known threatened species. So before we look at what we're going to achieve in the next decade, how well do we achieve in the previous one? Well, let's talk about what we know about the extinction crisis. Well, according to Al Gore in An Inconvenient Truth, we're looking at an extinction crisis with a rate of extinction 1,000 times higher than the normal background rate. You might wonder where Al Gore got that from, and the answer is he got it from me and from Gareth Russell, another Brit, Tom Brooks, another Brit. And I have to say, I was flattered to be quoted by Al Gore, but I'm even more honored to be flattered by this young woman holding up her extinction rate 1,000-fold sign in a demonstration somewhere in Britain. In the remote possibility that you recognize this young lady, I would love to know who she is so I can write to thank her. My work has never, ever been featured in a street demonstration before, and I'm very, very honored by that. So how do we know this? How do we know that we're driving species to extinction so fast? Well, why did Gore talk about the rate of extinction? Why can't we talk about the numbers of species going extinct per day, or how many species are threatened? And the problem is we really don't know how many species there are. We don't know how many fungi there are. We don't know how many species of insects there are. So talking about 3 or 30 or 300 species going extinct per day begs the question of whether we think there are a million species or 10 or 100 million species. So the numbers of species is not a secure parameter. But if we can't calculate the number, we can talk about the death rate of species. And that's something we can quantify. Now, let's consider an analogy to human death rate. In the US, we know that typically 8,100 people per million die per year. That's, as it were, the background rate. Over this last awful year, through the incredible incompetence of President Trump and his administration, that death rate was 9,770 people per million people per year. So the extinction rate has gone up because of COVID. We can do a similar sort of thing with species extinction. It's a death rate for species rather than individuals. And when we do that, we calculate extinction rates for birds and amphibians and mammals that are broadly in the range of 50 to 500 extinctions per million species per year. We also see that species that are described more recently have a higher extinction rate. That's because the species that were known in the 19th century are by and large species that are widespread and common, whereas species that we're discovering in the latter half of the 20th century are species that are rare. So we have an estimate of these extinction rates. We're now getting similar extinction rates of plants, some excellent work done by colleagues at Kew. We have similar data for fish, but not globally. We're beginning to produce a catalog of the death rates, the extinction rates of species. But what about their birth rates? How fast are species being formed? Now, thousands of scientists around the world take the group that interests them, grind them up and run them through sequences, and from their DNA work out these molecular phylogenies. This is a group of South African orchids in the genus Dissa. When you do that, you can come up with a birth rate. And for this particular group of orchids, it's about a quarter of a new species per million species per year. If you do that across large numbers of different species of plants and animals, we find that the birth rate of species is about 0.1 new species per million species per year on average. Some are faster, some are slower. What that allows us to do is to get that statistic that wonderful young woman mentioned in her demonstration poster. Species are dying off at 100 to 1,000, probably maybe 50 to 500, somewhere in that order. Extinctions per million species per year. And that's 1,000 times faster than species diversify. That's the problem that we need to address. Protecting species is mostly about protecting the places they live. So that's why these targets like 30, 30, 30 are so significant. How well are we protecting nature? Well, this is a global map of where we have protected the world. The areas that we have protected are in green. We've also shown in this map the places where people are and where they aren't. There's a measure of human impact called the, excuse me, the human footprint. And the areas shown in sort of pale yellow are the areas that have the least human impact, the half of Earth that has least human impact. Obviously, that's not Europe. Obviously, it includes places like the Arctic tundras, the Sahara, parts of the Amazon. If we look at where we've placed national parks, it's in these remote places. One of the questions that we have to ask is, as the politicians meet in Kunming later this year, they want to protect the low-hanging fruit. They want to protect the places that are easy to protect. They don't want to take on the difficult challenges. They're going to probably put the national parks where they are at the moment, because at the moment, most national parks are in these very, very remote places. A good example of this is the world's largest national park. It constitutes the northern third of Greenland. Now, I have actually been there. Well, I've flown past it. When you fly from the United States to Shanghai in China, you fly right over the pole. And this photograph taken out of the window at 10,000 meters plus is the top end of Greenland. It's a place that I have no particular desire to go and visit. It looks awfully cold to me, even in the summertime. There's very little biodiversity there. There's probably a few things that are there, but it's remote, it's wild, and it's a big protected area. I mean, it constitutes most of the protected area within European administration, but it's not going to do a lot for biodiversity. And that begs the question of how well we have allocated our national parks in a way that protects biodiversity. Because by and large, where we've put them are areas that don't have a lot of species. So let's summarize this in a Venn diagram. 13% of the land surface is protected. That's the ice-free land surface, I should point out. And 50% of the land surface is wilderness and 50% is not. That's an arbitrary division, but let's look at the wildest 50%. So given that Venn diagram, we can ask, how well does this allocation of protected areas protect species? Let's consider this hypothetical insect that has a huge geographical range. 13% of its range should be in protected areas, 50% in wilderness, 50% in higher density areas. That's what we expect by chance. What about small species? Well, here's a group of unicorn species so small and rare they haven't been discovered yet. We'd expect 13% of the species to be in protected areas, about half in wilderness, half in non-wilderness. So it doesn't matter whether you're looking at many small range species or a few large range species, you still find the same overall expectation. If we look at how well existing protected areas have done, we see that for species with large ranges, ranges of more than 1 million square kilometers, it's pretty much what we expect, that 13% or more of the species on average are in protected areas and close to 50% are in wild areas. So that's what we'd expect. The really, really interesting pattern is when we look at the most vulnerable species, species that have a high risk of extinction because they have small geographical ranges. There are two features of this graph. The first is we've done very, very much better at protecting these most vulnerable species than you'd expect. We haven't created large national parks for them, but we've created protected areas that are in the right places. The second feature is that were we to expand the protected area network, not just to 50, but to 30% of the planet, and just protect wild areas, we wouldn't improve things very much. The wild areas don't have a lot of species in them. So, you know, the conclusions are that despite our predilection for creating protected areas in remote, dry, cold places, we've actually put protected areas where they should be, in places that look after these glorious small range species, the Skywalker gibbon, which occurs in China, named after Luke Skywalker. It looks sort of like, you know, the older Luke Skywalker. Or this beautiful little frog, the Cassidy Horn's poison dart frog, that fantastically engaging a monkey in China, and so on. The world's protected areas are doing a better than expected job. And that's a message we want to get into Kunming. That's a message we want to get to, you know, to Boris Johnson and Xi Jinping and Biden and all the other leaders. Oh, hell, my computer is about to go to sleep because it's not plugged in. You're going to have to give me a 30-second break. My apologies for that. So we have done a better job than expected by putting our protected areas in the right place. We want to encourage the political leadership to continue to do that. Asking for 30% or 50% at random isn't going to work. So how can we do better? I'd like to play the first movie now, please.
We can map out the distribution of many species now in considerable detail. These are birds, and they show that the warm, wet tropics are where most of the species are. Mammals show a broadly similar pattern. These are the places with the greatest concentration of species, and it's likely to be true for most species. Amphibians, for example, show a similar pattern, and while we have less detailed data for plants, it's almost certainly true for them too. But just looking at species is not sufficient. We need to dig deeper. Let's look again at the distribution of bird species. In the Amazon, there are the greatest numbers of species. But if we look at where species have smaller than the median range size, those distributions are profoundly different. They concentrate in Central America and in the northern Andes, and in places like the coastal forests of Brazil. That's important because species with small ranges are much more vulnerable to extinction than species with large ranges. So let's take a world tour where threatened species are. Our first stop is the northern Andes, and Saving Nature is involved in several projects in Colombia and Ecuador, where the habitat destruction combined with the high numbers of small range species means that there are a lot of species at risk of extinction. Our second area of concern is in coastal Brazil. Again, loss of habitat, concentrations of small range species means that there are worrying numbers of threatened birds and mammals and amphibians and likely many other species in these forests. The final area where Saving Nature works is in tropical Asia. We have three areas of interest: the Western Ghats of India, Assam up in the northeast on the borders with China, and the Lusa ecosystem of northern Sumatra. These maps are what we call strategic maps. They tell us where in the world we need to act, but they don't tell us exactly how to act. For that we need tactical maps like this one, and I'll explain those on the project pages for each of the various places where Saving Nature works.
So if we look at coastal Brazil as an example, it's where the greatest number of threatened species are. It's a concentration of small-ranged amphibians, mammals, orchids, birds, a lot of other taxa. And when we look at that area in detail, we can begin to see why. It used to be completely forested. When Darwin visited here in the 1830s, it was all forest. Much of the forest has been removed. If we look in at this area just near the city of Rio de Janeiro and color code the forest, we can see how little the forest remains. And moreover, by playing around with the GIS, we can show that much of that forest is in tiny fragments. What I've been doing in the second image is eliminating patches of forest less than 100 hectares. That's what it looks like. Now, this is a photograph of forest islands. This is where my work started when I was a birder in Britain in the 60s, counting birds on small islands. These are forest islands surrounded by a sea of cattle pastures. When we map out the diversity, we can see that the greatest number of threatened species are in these forest islands. And we know from studies done by real forest islands, comparing them to the islands off the coast of Britain, we know that species in these small fragments will disappear quickly. This is a study done in the Amazon. You can see the forest islands that were created by clearing the area for cattle pastures. And we know from those studies that small islands lose species quickly. We can come up with a practical guide that says you need to have an island of at least 10,000 hectares to slow species losses. And that gives you a practical insight in what you need to do. You need to reconnect forest landscapes. Would you play the second video, please?
We'll identify the places where the greatest number of species are at risk of extinction. And when we do that, we often find they're in very fragmented landscapes. They're not in large areas of continuous forest like the Amazon, but they're in the biodiversity hotspots, and those places have already lost a lot of their habitats.
A good example of this is in the forest to the east of the city of Rio de Janeiro in coastal Brazil. This map shows the fragments and the number of threatened species that they contain. We have not just merely destroyed so much of the world's tropical forests. What we have left behind is in tatters, in fragments. And those fragments are often too small for species to maintain viable populations. There just aren't enough males to go around for the females and females to go around for the males. And of all the places, of all the fragments, one that I thought was particularly tragic was the one immediately behind me. This is the Union Biological Reserve in coastal Brazil, about 100 miles east of the city of Rio de Janeiro. Because in this isolated patch of forest are a whole load of species on the brink of extinction, the most charismatic of which is a beautiful little monkey called tamarin. And the golden lion tamarins in that fragment could not go forth and multiply into the forest over there because there was the cattle pasture behind me. And when I saw that cattle pasture for the first time, about a cattle pasture just like the one I'm standing in, I thought it has to go. And so we have made it go away. This is a restored forest. I helped raise money for my friends at the Asociación Mico León Dorado, the Golden Lion Tamarin Association. I've planted this forest, and it now connects that once isolated fragment of forest in the Union Biological Reserve to a much larger area of forest over in this direction. It's what we call a biological corridor. And it means that the golden lion tamarins that were once imprisoned in this forest island, this forest fragment behind me, can now cross through these small but growing trees and go and find new habitats, new homes, new places for their tamarin families.
So what I've told you today is that wishing for 30% is a great idea, but it's not necessary to protect all of biodiversity. We can protect a lot of species, perhaps the great majority of them, or much less, providing we're smart about it. But it's also not sufficient. There are going to be places around the world where we need to protect a lot more than 30%, and the Amazon is clearly one of those places. It also begs a lot of details. Just protecting another 400,000 hectares of Great Britain is not going to address the fact that we need to restore Britain's biodiversity, its original forest, its original habitats, its original wetlands. So just talking about 30% sort of misses all the details which are so vital. And globally, it tends to overlook the small-scale local solutions that are frankly the ones most responsible for protecting most species. Saving nature, we haven't protected a large fraction of the world's land, but we have connected a very, very much larger fraction of land than what we have bought by stitching together the pieces. So there's a lot we can do. There's a lot of actions that we can effect. And being able to do that comes from a knowledge of natural history, of biodiversity. And we Brits are extraordinarily lucky in having this really amazing tradition of natural history in Britain. And I think building on that is the way in which we're going to be able to lead and protect biodiversity for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart. That was fabulous and inspiring as ever, and delighted to host you. Okay, so while I'm waiting for some questions to come into the chat, I've got a question for you, which is, we can have the science and we can have the solutions, and you've demonstrated one wonderful local solution there, but how do we convince governments like the current one in Brazil to protect 70% of the Amazon? Because I think that's one of the most challenging questions in conservation at the moment.
I agree, and it's so dependent on the different political leaders that we have. I mean, we're very fortunate in Britain that a concern about the environment it has support across the aisles. I mean, both Labour and Tories are supportive of biodiversity broadly. That's not true in the United States, where we had, particularly during the last 4 years of Trump, an awful uphill battle to protect environmental legislation. China has a president in Xi Jinping who is committed to what he calls ecological civilization. He's very committed to protecting the planet. So the global lesson is that we need to engage our politicians. And my concern for many of my scientist colleagues is that they think they can do the science and then let others do the politicking. We can't. I think we have a responsibility as scientists to engage our political leaders and make sure they hear what we're saying. Easier in Britain than in other countries, but everywhere we need to let politicians know. The second thing is there are quite clearly consumer actions that we can take. I don't eat a lot of meat. I eat a little bit of meat, but I've reduced my meat because of environmental concerns. I eat rather more fish, and I'm very careful to make sure that I'm eating sustainably harvested fish. That's fairly easy to check in this day and age. And then I think, frankly, there are consumer boycotts. I think that Britain and Europe is becoming quite aggressive towards Brazil and saying, look, burning the rainforest is just not acceptable. We do not want to buy your beef. We do not want to buy your soy. If you're going into forests and murdering the indigenous peoples who live there and converting forests into what in fact are really poor cattle pastures. So I think those kind of consumer actions can be very effective too.
Okay, fabulous. Just continuing down that line. So, what's your 2-minute elevator pitch to a politician about saving, maintaining, and enhancing biodiversity on this planet?
It's a matter of the 3 E's, and yes, I know how to spell. The first one is ethical. I think we have an ethical responsibility, perhaps a religious responsibility to protect the planet. I'm not a Catholic, but the Pope's Laudato Si', his encyclical of a few years ago, is not only a very powerful statement of what's wrong with the planet, there's a great chapter on biodiversity, but a powerful ethical statement of how we should protect it. The second is aesthetics. Who would want to tell their children that lions and tigers and bears and other wonderful species have gone extinct? We appreciate nature. The final thing is economics. Our national parks, whether they're the Peak District National Park or whether it's Yellowstone, bring in a huge amount of economic revenue to the countries nearby. Biodiversity is valuable, and we should protect it for all of those 3 reasons.
Thank you. I've got a question now from Julie Clive, who says, as an artist working in the field of connecting biodiversity, science and art, at times I feel my efforts are too small. Do you think collaborations are key to create a greater awareness and then action? Thank you, Julie Clive.
Great question. Absolutely. We did a fundraiser for Saving Nature, and we were approached by 2 wonderful ladies in Britain who work for the Star Wars enterprise. They, sort of build, the various props that are part of that. And they sculpted a orangutan and said, could we use this sculpture to help orangutans? So we raffled it off very successfully. And with the money, we bought a key piece of property in Sumatra that is a habitat corridor for orangutans. So yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting that you should be sending us your artwork and we'll raffle it off. I think there are definite ways in which we can go for that second E, the one that doesn't start with the E, aesthetics. People value, appreciate, find nature wonderful. So let's work together and have that combination so that people are able to find this resonance between art and science.
Thank you so much. So one last question from me, which is how are we doing in terms of marine ecosystems and protecting marine biodiversity?
Well, be careful how I say that in this politically correct age. The sun still does not set on the British Empire. And that's because we Brits still manage a large number of remote, I'd like to say godforsaken little rocks around the world that are the remnants of our empire. And it might not be that those places constitute a very large area, but they have very, very substantial protected areas or potential protected areas around them. One of the key players there is Michael Pinkowski, who was a classmate of mine at Bemrose and has now retired from the British government, but is still actively involved in these British overseas territories. So we Brits, by setting aside protected areas around these remnants of our empire, are in a position to effect very, very substantial protection in the marine realm. I think the rapidly changing perspective is that we can protect a lot more of the ocean by setting aside no-take zones. And Britain has been, and I think will continue to be, a leader in doing that.
Fantastic. I've got a question now from Mitchell Lakin, who asks, I know you've mentioned a few ways, but what are some of the best things, in your opinion, the everyday person can do to reduce their impact on species extinction?
Well, I think there's a lot of different things we could do. First of all, I think we can be a lot smarter in our consumer choices. There is no doubt that in America we use a huge amount more in terms of natural resources than Britons do. So that the individual choices, what we eat, how much we drive, how we heat and cool our homes, is your home energy efficient? Are you driving more than you need to? Are you eating a food that is energetically efficient? There's a lot of those personal choices that you can make. I mean, I could not live without coffee, but the coffee I drink is it's fair trade, organic, bird-friendly coffee. There's a long number of simple consumer choices that we make. And the second thing is, engage the politicians. Politicians need to hear from us. We are fortunate to have a democracy. We sometimes think it's probably an insufficiently good one, but let politicians know. And then, of course, volunteer for local or even national or even international organizations that are involved in these issues.
Thank you. So we've just got some thank yous here. We've got a thank you from Sean Davis-Vallum, who is the head of the School of Built and Natural Environment, who says, "Thank you, Stuart, really enjoyed your talk." We have a thank you from Julie Clive, whose question you answered at first, who says you echo her thoughts exactly. So that's fabulous. And I guess a final thanks from myself too. It's a great honour and a pleasure to host you back in your, I guess, almost home university in a way. And, obviously conservation biologists like me have followed your work for a very long time. So it's a great honour to have you and hear from you. And I'd just like to thank you very much. So I don't know if we can do a round of applause in some way, but thank you very, very much. And I want to wish you all the very best with what you do in the future, helping to save the biodiversity on this planet and helping to convince the people who need to know that it's the right thing to do. So thank you very much indeed, sincerely.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.